immense personality that would rattle the cages of the establishment from the safety of radio and record shops. Yet although fully aware of his responsibilities as a figurehead of the protest movement, Jagger was keen not to rock the boat so much as to draw the wrong kind of attention.
Mick was interviewed by magazines that were of a leftish nature, including Student, which was edited by Richard Branson, and another journal called The Process. And his general feeling was that he supported pacifism, he supported sort of dissident popular opinion, but he never made any doctrinal statement as such. He was on the periphery of the student riots in London in 1968, and he felt sympathy towards what was going on in France at the time. But I think his cautious nature wouldn't permit him to make any sort of committal as far as that was concerned. It didn't help, I think, with his standing with authority when him and Keith came up with Street Fighting Man, which was very much a reflection on the post-Flower Power sense of revolution.
Just in the same way that I think he was genuinely inspired initially by the Summer of Love and the hippie ethos. I think he was also moved by the spirit of '68, which was quite different from the spirit of '67, and was, demonstrations in Grosvenor Square outside the American Embassy. Possibly, a lot of the students that were on those demonstrations came from the LSE. And he's thinking, well, 6 years ago, that was him. He was a student at the LSE, and, had he been 6 years younger, he'd have been in Grosvenor Square. He's also possibly a little bit cautious because of what he's been through in '67. They've locked him up, they've busted him, they've taken him to court. '68, things turn a lot nastier. This is no longer just people smoking pot. This is people hurling bricks at policemen outside the American Embassy in a protest at a war on the other side of the world, which is killing thousands of people. Things have got nasty, they've got vicious. So possibly Jagger is cautious at this stage. They came for him the year before and they stuck him in jail for a night. What are they going to do to him this time? They've just assassinated Martin Luther King, without making it sound too melodramatic. I'm sure all of this is playing in Jagger's head. He doesn't want to be the first rock and roll martyr.
Despite watching the events of '68 unfold from a somewhat guarded perspective, Jagger was still held in high regard. His music had not only helped enhance the sentiment of revolution in the air, but also offered an historical marker that would forever represent the mood of the period. He fittingly capped this achievement by moving his characterizations one final step as he projected the role of the devil, the zenith for his exaggerated bad boy image.
As it was when the Stones sort of got going, I think he played up to the sort of public perception of him. And there was a certain, dabbling with Satanism, I suppose, but I don't think that he was, I don't think he necessarily saw himself as some kind of, if you like, young person's priest.
And Mick just kind of used things like sympathy with the devil and the satanic connections because he saw that as a good wheeze to produce a commercial song or a performance, that could give him some kind of dramatic leverage, I think, I don't think he was seriously into anything like that. He was too bright.
And at the time, there were kind of groups of that type around. I'm thinking of, the crazy world of Arthur Brown, Black Sabbath, Black Widow, all those sort of things that were very much into that sort of satanic, sort of fetishist gear that they wore on stage, and, with titles like Hand of Doom and Come to the Sabbath. as well as the literature that he was absorbing at the time, he was also, you know, sort of paying heed to what else was going on. I mean, I think that Sympathy for the Devil was a very daring thing to do, lyrically anyway.
I mean, you look at the lyrics for Sympathy for the Devil, that is great writing. Great writing of any kind. A playwright, a poet would be pleased to have written that. He really dared to be great. I mean, to say things like, they shouted out, "Who killed the Kennedys?" when after all it was you and me. I mean, that wound was still raw. That was a bleeding wound. Robert Kennedy had just been killed. You can't imagine anybody doing that today. It's too real. And by reflecting the news, it was a musical version of the news. And since what was going on was horror, the music became horror.
If Sympathy for the Devil was the highlight of Mick Jagger's career already, then where else was there left to go for the 26-year-old? By 1969, Mick was a massive star, and it was no surprise that he was drawing attention from members of the film world who would attempt to provide him with a new creative path.
Of all the Stones, Mick had the most serious possibilities as a screen actor. I mean, the Stones themselves didn't make a sort of collective film, but, you know, Mick was being courted by directors and producers almost as soon as the Stones really made it big. He didn't tend to pay much attention to the scripts that came in. He'd read it for a bit and decide it wasn't for him. But eventually, I mean, he found one he liked.
There's been a mistake. You can't have the room. What? It's not for rent.
The script Mick chose was for a film called Performance, which featured James Fox as gangster Chaz and Jagger as former rock musician Turner, whose worlds collide when Chaz seeks refuge from the mob in Turner's basement.
Got a lot of work to do. Got a lot of pressure. Yeah. No, I don't want it.
Released to mixed critical reviews in 1970 after several delays, the film was far from the light-hearted swinging 60s romp that it was originally conceived as. Instead, it featured graphic violence, sex and drug abuse, and was experimental in its nature. Despite the film's reception, Jagger received recognition for his portrayal of Turner.
Artistically, that was one of his finest moments. He certainly came across as a better sort of celluloid proposition than other pop stars that were sort of delving into film, like sort of Dave Clark, John Lennon, Paul Jones. And I think it's something that he perhaps might have pursued more assiduously than he actually did.
The only really successful role he's ever played was Performance, because to a certain degree he was playing himself, although in some ways more Brian Jones than himself. But he was doing something that he knew about. He knew about that whole narcissistic, schizophrenic kind of behaviour that was associated with the role that he'd been given in Performance.
We push the buttons. He's the horror show. He's an old pro. He can take it. He takes it. He dishes it out to you. Bet your sweet fucking life he does. He's a mean bastard. I'm the Lone Ranger. He'll take you down.
It was very turned in on itself for him, I think. You know, I think he found it quite difficult. Difficult in the sense, not that he didn't understand it, but he